I went to the University of Chicago as a Marxist. After a year of studying under Milton Friedman, I was still a Marxist. But one summer of working in the government was enough to start returning around.
Really, what happened to you there?
Well, nothing happened to me, but that I realized that the government was nowhere close to being capable of doing what people on the left wanted the government to do. And that, in fact, we'd be lucky if they didn't make things worse. For example, I was in the Labor Department, and they administered the minimum wage law. To me, the question was, did minimum wage laws make poor people better off or worse off? Mm-hmm. That was not the question for them. The minimum wage law provided 1/3 of their total budget, and they weren't going to look at this other way. And as I tried to get into the question of does this cause unemployment and stuff like that, there was no enthusiasm whatsoever for that whole line of. You know, empirical evidence does matter.
It does. I see less of it than you do.
I'm willing to believe that because you've said so. I've been asking you for it and I haven't gotten any of it. So I'm perfectly willing to agree with you on that.
But
gentlemen, we have 1 minute.
The major piece of empirical evidence that I think you've cited this hour has really been the contrast between the 60s and the 70s.
No, it's been the contrast between well-off people and badly off people. And that's true in other countries as well, that in Malaysia, where they've had affirmative action for the same amount of time, it's had the same results. It has done nothing for the poor Malays. The lowest level of Malays receive a smaller percentage of all the income received by Malays today than before this program was put into effect, as is true of blacks in the United States.
Is it worthless to do something for anybody but the very poor?
I would like to see the well-off take care of themselves. If they can't, who can?
Thank you very much.
No, I would agree with that, but you would also have to agree that generally speaking, women are paid less, for example, for the same jobs as men.
No, I would not. I would not agree with that. If you're talking about women with the same number of years of experience, with the same continuous service, et cetera, then when I look at that, I don't find that disparity. I find, for example, in many cases, the women are making more, depending upon how you break the data down. The difference with women is between married women and everybody else. That's the real difference.
Well, even as to single women, the Census Bureau statistics, the most recent ones I could find, 1978, say that single men are earning $11,100 and single women are earning $9,300.
Yes, I love the word single that is used. When I did my study, I didn't use single, I used never married. You see, a woman who is single at age 40, having spent 10 or 20 years raising children, is really not quite the same as a man of age 40 who's been working continuously for 20 years.
And the differential she cited is not that great, so it could easily be accounted for by the
Yes, because when I break them down the other way, I did this for the academic world, and there I found the women who are never married, which is the term the way I take it, there they were earning more than the men. And similarly, when the government did data some years ago on women who had been working continuously since high school into their 30s, there you found that they were making slightly more than men of the same description. So the difference is between married women and everybody else. And married men get an extra bonus because their wives take care of many things that enable them to put more time into their careers.
I'm sure you're aware of the fact.
In intellectuals in society, whom do you mean?
I mean people whose end products are ideas. There are other people with great intelligence whose end products are things like the Salk vaccine.
A research scientist is not necessarily an intellectual.
That's right.
An engineer isn't necessarily an intellectual.
That's right. Because the engineer is judged by the end product, which is not simply ideas. If he builds a building that collapses, it doesn't matter how brilliant his idea was, he's ruined. Conversely, if an intellectual who's brilliant has an idea for rearranging society, and that ends in disaster, he pays no price at all.
I see. Let me quote intellectuals in society, quote, "The fatal misstep of intellectuals is assuming that superior ability within a particular realm can be generalized to superior wisdom or morality overall. Chess grandmasters, musical prodigies, and others who are as remarkable within their respective specialties as intellectuals within theirs seldom make that mistake." Explain that. Why would it, well, let's take an example. Noam Chomsky, whom you write about in Intellectuals in Society, whose work in linguistics, in the first place, I can't understand it, but as best I can tell, everyone who understands his technical work within the field, within his discipline of linguistics, considers him one of the great figures of the 20th century. And his work in politics?
Absurdity. The same could be said of Bertrand Russell and his Landmark works on mathematics, and other people in other fields, but they step outside their field. And when you step outside your level of specialty, sometimes that's like stepping off a cliff.
And why is it that intellectuals, that is to say people whose end product is ideas, should succumb to that temptation more than, to use your example, a chess grandmaster?
Because a chess grandmaster can be world famous for doing absolutely nothing more than winning chess tournaments and making displays, as many of them do, of playing 5 chess games simultaneously while blindfolded.
So Bobby Fischer had no need to opine on the politics of the day because he was getting rich and famous and making a brilliant career for himself within his narrow profession.
That's right. That's right.
But intellectuals, what? They
Well,
languish in obscurity, no matter how smart.
Well, the whole question of when is someone well known or not came up during the visit of Jim Flynn from New Zealand here a few years ago. He's one of the world's authorities on IQ tests. Mm-hmm. People, in India know about Jim Flynn. People in England, he made a world tour. But I doubt if the people in the next block from where he lives know who he is.
I see. All right.
Against this background of historic issues about the very meaning of law, it is both ironic and appalling that Judge Bork's own record is being judged on a myopic basis of an issue-by-issue statistical box score on how he has allegedly voted for or against one class of litigants or another, as if he liked chemical companies more than he liked pregnant women, or liked asbestos manufacturers better than he liked bereaved widows. Surely no responsible person thinks that this is what law is all about. Yet such shrill propaganda from special interest groups is repeated in respectable quarters as if the statistics represented some objective fact. Many people have no idea how utterly worthless and therefore deceptive such statistical box scores can be. Last year this time in California, there was a bitter election campaign over the re-election of the state Chief Justice. During that campaign, one side cited statistics to show that the Chief Justice had voted for defendants 85% of the time over a period of nearly a decade. The other side, using exactly the same raw statistical data for exactly the same span of years, concluded that the Chief Justice had voted for the prosecution nearly 90% of the time. These are not small differences, either in terms of numbers or implications. Neither were they based on any esoteric statistical methods. All that they depended upon were differences in definition as to what was a vote for the prosecution. The statistics thrown around recklessly as to how Judge Bork has allegedly voted against women X% of the time or for some other class of litigants Y% of the time are no more reliable than the definitions used by the special interest sources from which they come. Arbitrary definitions are no less arbitrary when they are expressed in numbers rather than words. Taking these box scores seriously reflects either a dangerously naive gullibility about statistics or an even more dangerously cynical view of the truth. The same kind of box score approach has been used against Judge Bork in the racial area, except that all the things Mr. Bork has done to advance the civil rights of blacks and Asians are either ignored or played down, while every legal question he has raised about any portion of any civil rights law or court decision has been automatically defined by his critics as being anti-civil rights or anti-black. Obviously, I wouldn't be here if I believed any of that.
Would it be your feeling that if all the affirmative action programs were discontinued, women and minorities would go ahead much faster than they have under the affirmative action programs?
Yes, it's not my opinion. The data indicate that, for example, Puerto Ricans had a higher percentage of the national average income before quotas than after. So did Mexican Americans. Blacks have about the same. So there's, again, is a marvelous putting of the burden on other people. You're saying here's this massive program that has existed now for a decade,
That's
and
not
you're
very-
unable to show me
Things have
the
gotten better.
benefits that have come from all this enormous controversy.
Well, I certainly has been a revolution insofar as women's participation in the labor force.
Not
and in the
really,
professions
not
that's
really.
concerned.
No, it hasn't. No,
I
it
know
hasn't.
that of my own knowledge.
No, you don't know it of your own knowledge because I've also looked at the same thing. And in the past, you found women overrepresented in many professional occupations, much more so than today. And you find that decline in those occupations much more highly correlated with a lower age of marriage for college women and with more childbearing. And as those two things, those two demographic factors have changed, women have also changed in their representation. So there's this whole myth that's been created that this is all a function of political developments of the past decade or so, just will not stand up.
Thank you very much.
New York Times writer Nicholas Kristof, I'm quoting you, asserts that there is you're quoting him, overwhelming evidence that centuries of racial subjugation still shape inequity in the 21st century, quote, closing quote, and he mentions, open quote, the lingering effects of slavery, close quote. And now this is Tom Sowell. If we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, in 1960, which would be almost 100 years after the end of slavery,
Right.
22% of black kids grew up in homes with only one parent.
Just 22%.
Yes.
4 out of 5 were in homes with both parents.
Yes. 30 years later, after the liberal welfare state, that number had more than tripled. And so I say, well, let us compare, if we can speculate on how much that 22% was due to the legacy of slavery. But we know that tripling was not due to the legacy of slavery. It was due to the legacy of a whole different set of policies. And you can look at it so many other ways. Education. Stuyvesant High School in New York, as you know, you get into only by passing a very tough exam. In 2012, the percentage of black students who had gotten into Stuyvesant High School was less than 1/10 of the percentage of black students who had gotten into Stuyvesant High School 33 years earlier.
I didn't know that.
There's Dunbar High School in Washington, which was an elite black high school for a very long time. In 1993, the number of kids out of Dunbar High School who went on to college was less than it was 60 years earlier, which would have been in the depth of the Great Depression. And so you can run through a whole bunch of other things like that. Look at the housing projects. The housing projects in the first half of the 20th century, during that first 100 years after slavery, did not have the high crime rates, the murder rates, the graffiti, all the rest of it. We associate. None of that was there. People, like the New York Times, Kristof should read his own old papers, pointed out that on Saturday mornings it was common in the housing project of this earlier era for parents to leave their doors unlocked because some of the parents could afford television, some couldn't. So the ones who had television would leave their doors unlocked, and the kids from the other families could come down there and watch television with them. Well, now the latest figures show that most people below the poverty line have 2 television sets and cable, but they wouldn't dare leave their doors unlocked in a public housing project.
Are you saying that in a culturally pluralistic society such as America, are you saying that the variable in success or lack of success is the culture of the particular group?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying it not only for the United States, but in terms of the studies of various other countries around the world, the same thing seems to be true. You not only find the same group having the same characteristics in country after the country. That is, the Germans produced the first pianos in Australia. They created the piano industry in the United States. They built the first pianos in England. They built the first pianos in Russia. You look at the Chinese, what they major in Malaysia in college is what they major in the United States in college.
Namely science and chemistry.
Science and technology, heavily. And this follows the group around the world. So the notion that the group is a creature of society, that society has shaped the group, just will not stand up to the facts.
If you say that culture is the variable in success, which means conversely, culture is the variable in failure, and you cite the phenomenal achievement of West Indians, which is the largest black immigrant group in the United States.
Yes.
Their phenomenal success in the United States, I think they earn about, second generation earns about 15% more
Than the average American.
Than the average American. But they don't do well in their own native countries, and they don't do well in England. Now, if culture is the variable, why is that a fact?
I guess you'd have a selective migration coming into this. That's also true of other groups, by the way. The Chinese are prosperous everywhere in the world except China. The Indians are prosperous throughout Africa, but they are in terrible shape in India. They are prosperous in Malaysia. They're prosperous in other parts of Burma at one time. There are many groups which, when freed from the constraints of their particular society, burst forth with all the other abilities that they have. In their own homes, they're throttled by various other factors.
Now, as was explained to me, it is the notion of, let's say you're on the admissions committee at Harvard, and you're going to choose so many people. You're going to let people in for a variety of reasons. One is sheer academic merit. They scored 1,600 on the college boards. That's a good entry. They've got a brilliant academic and athletic background, and they happen to be a virtuoso violin player. You know?
Oh, yeah.
And the violin player helps.
Yeah.
Or let's say they come from Nevada, and they don't have a lot of Nevada at Harvard. And let's also say that they come from Sri Lanka. They don't have many people from Sri Lanka there. And let's also say that they also are African American, and that ought to be a factor in choosing from that pool. Maybe that's one of the considerations.
Because what?
Because diversity of a student body is a healthy factor.
I'm fascinated with the extent to which words, we're conditioned to react like Pavlov's dog to words. I hear diversity. Someone was asking me...
Don't make me look bad, Professor.
Someone today who was a trustee of a college was saying that they were going to pick a new college professor. I said, what you should do is have a stopwatch there and just count how long it is till each of the contestants says the word diversity. And the guy who says it, you know, he's 35 minutes into the interview, and the other guy who says it, you know, the first sentence, the guy who takes 35 minutes, he should be at the top of the list. The guy who said it the first sentence should be at the bottom. Because the question
well, what's wrong with diversity? I don't get the point.
My point is that this is a word that has become magic. What does it mean, if anything? Are you saying to me that all black people are alike, therefore you've got to mix and match by race? It's not diverse unless it's diverse along these dimensions?
No, I'll tell you what I'm saying. I'm saying that I think that it would be different to have people of different kinds of experiences. And we mentioned Sri Lanka, didn't we? And you know, and it'd be interesting to have some people with an Asian background. Wait, an Asian background, African American, people that come from Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue, as well as from Henderson, North Carolina. All of that would make a healthy student body.
You mean to tell me?
I don't think everybody ought to come from sons of Harvard graduates.
Places like Harvard and Stanford and Cornell. What you have is the black son of the black doctor, who lived in the same neighborhood with the white son of the white doctor.
No, I got
and now you're giving me diversity because these two people
but
someplace.
not necessarily. They have scholarships that they offer to kids who are not the son of
but now we're getting away from the whole racial thing. I'm saying the racial thing has been used as a proxy for something that is not a proxy for, because the vast majority of blacks who go to places like Harvard and Cornell and Stanford are not blacks from the ghetto. Those are blacks from out there. You know, they're from Malibu. You know, they're from Pacific Palisades. They're from Winnetka and so forth. And they're from the very same neighborhoods. They're from the very same neighborhoods as the whites are there. And so now you call it diversity because you see something with the naked eye.
I ask a question about unemployment. The latest figures I saw indicated that of black youth, something like 46% of those who wanted jobs were unable to get jobs. I really would like this time to ask both of you to respond to what would you do in that situation. If you would assume for a moment that these are people who do want jobs and are unable to find work.
I would, first of all, repeal the minimum wage law, because if you go back to, say, 1950, 1948, 49, 50, you find that at that time, the unemployment rate among black teenagers was a fraction of what it is today. And there certainly wasn't any less racism then than there is today. What was different was that at that time, the minimum wage law was a decade old.
It was a decade of inflation, and the law hadn't been changed. So for all practical purposes, it didn't exist.
Well, don't you think
And
that
as
was also a decade of expansion in which there were a lot of jobs, whereas today our economy is in a recession and there are not that many jobs
If you look at the
available.
most prosperous years of the 60s and 70s, you don't find black teenage unemployment as low as it was in the recession year of 1949.
Well, I don't know what the job situation was then, but it's only recently that we have
I
reached
do. I was a
point.
black teenager in 1949.
Did you
it
get a
was a recession year, and after a considerable looking, I found a job. But the point is, the kid who was living where I lived then, who's living there now, he has a hell of a lot harder time finding that job because there are so many good people who have tried to do good for him and priced him right out of the market.
Well, facing the situation...
Healthcare. Let me give you a quotation and a fact. The quotation comes from you in Basic Economics. Quote, "A long-standing staple of political rhetoric has been the attempt to keep the prices of medical care reasonable or affordable. Yet the amount of resources required to supply the things we want are wholly independent of what we are willing to pay. It is completely unreasonable to expect reasonable prices." That's the quotation. Here's the fact. The United States devotes 17% of its GDP to healthcare. The next country down in that is Switzerland at about 11% of its GDP. So we devote something like 50% more than the next country down. Now, surely it's not unreasonable to suggest that we're just spending too much.
The question is, when people are spending their own money, I don't know how third parties can say it's too much. Well, ironically, Rahm Emanuel's brother, who's a doctor, has on board for this whole Obamacare thing. But really, he revealed why Americans spend more. Americans don't, when they go to a hospital, they are in private or semi-private rooms more often than in countries on government health care. And so instead of being in a ward, you're in your own private or semi-private room. It costs more. American doctors are more readily available. There is less waiting time. Some people prefer to pay in money and other in waiting time. Now, when you have a painful disease and the government tells you there's a 6-month waiting list, that you're paying in a different way. It doesn't show up in the statistics. But you may not even live the 6 months, depending upon what you have.
So we pay more and get more.
That's it.
That's it? That's all there is to it?
That's it.
You don't want to say, but at the same time, our system is terribly inefficient in various ways?
No, it's not inefficient for people to buy what they want.
It has to be more complicated than that.
What's inefficient is having third parties decide what you need and don't need. As, for example, in Sweden, where and it's not like an insurance company saying they won't pay for it. In Sweden, if they say that you don't need this, you can't pay for it with your own money because they control the whole system. And so your choice at that point is to leave Sweden, which if you're very sick may be a little hard to do, or to have what you need smuggled into you.
Right. Tom?
But this sort of reminded me of what's happening with these Wall Street protests. And this is what you said from the Thomas Sowell Reader. This is the age of complaining classes, whether they are lawyers, community activists, radical feminists, race hustlers, or other squeaking wheels looking for oil. No society ever thrived because it had a large and growing class of parasites living off of those who produce. Is what we're hearing with these Wall Street protests just from this complaining class?
Oh, absolutely. I can't imagine when I was their age that I would have enough money that I could afford to hang around in parks for weeks on end, not doing any work and not bringing in any income.
Well, and the incredible thing is they're